Bill Belichick reacts to Pro Football Hall of Fame snub in most Bill Belichick way possible. Out of my control. Bill Belichick's reaction to missing out on a first ballot Pro Football Hall of Fame induction fits perfectly into the long-standing identity he has built over decades in the NFL. It is controlled, minimal, and intentionally detached from emotion, especially when it comes to topics that sit outside of his direct influence. For a coach who has spent most of his career emphasizing preparation, accountability, and eliminating distractions, the Hall of Fame debate represents exactly the kind of external narrative he has never allowed to define him. And even now, after one of the most decorated coaching careers in football history, that approach has not changed. Belichick was not selected for induction in his first year of eligibility, despite a resume that many would consider among the greatest ever in professional sports. 6 Super Bowl championships as a head coach, the most playoff wins in NFL history, and a top 3 ranking in all-time regular season victories. On paper, the credentials are overwhelming. For many observers, they would seem more than sufficient for immediate enshrinement. But the Hall of Fame process has never been purely about statistics or rings. It involves voting dynamics, timing, perception, and comparisons to other eras and candidates. And in Belichick's case, those factors combined to delay what many assumed would be an automatic first ballot selection. The reaction across the football world was immediate. Analysts, former players, and media personalities debated whether the decision reflected an overly strict interpretation of coaching impact or whether it was simply a matter of timing in a crowded field of candidates. Some argued that Belichick's influence on the modern NFL alone should guarantee first ballot status. Others pointed to the complexity of his legacy, including his time as a general manager and the mixed results in his post-Tom Brady years, as factors that may have influenced voters. Amid all of that discussion, Belichick himself chose a very different path. When asked about the snub during an appearance on the Hangout with Sean Hannity podcast, he delivered a short, direct response. Out of my control. That phrase, while simple, is loaded with meaning when viewed through the lens of Belichick's career philosophy. It is not just a dismissal of the question. It is a reflection of a broader worldview that has defined how he operates within the sport. If something cannot be directly influenced through preparation, execution, or decision-making, it is treated as secondary. Rather than expanding on the Hall of Fame discussion or expressing personal frustration, Belichick immediately shifted the focus back to his current responsibilities. He emphasized that his attention is centered on coaching at North Carolina, where he is continuing to build a program and establish structure in a new environment. That redirection is consistent with how he has always handled external pressure. Throughout his time in New England, Belichick rarely engaged with award discussions, media narratives, or public debates about legacy. Even during championship runs, he maintained a steady focus on week-to-week preparation rather than long-term recognition. In many ways, this is what made his coaching style so effective. Players understood that attention to detail and execution mattered far more than external validation. The message was always consistent. The only thing that matters is what happens on the field. Still, even for someone as reserved as Belichick, the Hall of Fame discussion carries a different weight because it represents the ultimate historical judgment of a career. It is not about a single season or a single decision. It is about how an entire body of work is remembered and evaluated. Interestingly, Belichick did acknowledge the public reaction to his omission. He noted that he appreciated the support he received from various figures across the football world and beyond. Reports indicated that former players, analysts, and even prominent public figures voiced their disagreement with the decision. That support included strong opinions from individuals like Tom Brady, his former quarterback and longtime partner in New England's dynasty. Brady himself expressed confusion over the outcome and suggested that Belichick's resume speaks for itself. Given their shared history, Brady's comments carried additional weight, reinforcing the significance of what the two accomplished together. Beyond football, the conversation even extended into broader cultural spaces, with figures outside the sport commenting on the decision. That level of attention highlights just how influential Belichick's career has been, not only within the NFL, but across the wider sports landscape. Despite that attention, Belichick did not dwell on it. He acknowledged it briefly, then moved on. That pattern is also visible in how he addressed other topics during the same interview. One of them involved his now widely discussed CBS interview, which gained attention after interruptions from his girlfriend, Jordan Hudson. The segment became a viral moment after portions of the interview were edited or removed, particularly during questions related to their relationship. Belichick described the situation as done very deceptively and stated that he had requested the full transcript from CBS but had not received it. While he did express dissatisfaction, he did not escalate the issue further during the conversation, again returning to his default approach of controlled commentary rather than extended criticism. What stands out in all of this is the consistency. Whether the topic is media scrutiny, personal relationships, or Hall of Fame recognition, Belichick's communication style remains unchanged. He provides brief answers, avoids emotional escalation, and quickly redirects attention to football or current responsibilities. That consistency is part of what has defined his public persona for decades. It also contributes to why moments like this Hall of Fame snub generate such widespread discussion. Because while others may interpret it as a major slight or controversial decision, Belichick treats it as something that exists outside his sphere of control. From a football perspective, his legacy is already secure in most conversations. Few coaches have ever matched his combination of longevity, success, and adaptability. His ability to win across different rosters, systems, and eras places him in a category that is difficult to compare directly with others. But the Hall of Fame conversation introduces a different kind of evaluation. It is not about weekly preparation or tactical superiority. It is about historical placement, narrative framing, and how voters weigh different aspects of a career. And in that context, even the most accomplished figures in the sport are not guaranteed immediate recognition. For Belichick, however, that uncertainty does not appear to be a concern. His response suggests that he has already mentally separated his coaching identity from external validation systems like awards or honors. Instead, his focus remains on the present, building a program, coaching players, preparing for the next challenge. That approach has defined his entire career. And even now, as one of the most accomplished figures in NFL history, it remains unchanged. The Hall of Fame decision may continue to generate debate among fans and analysts, but for Belichick, the answer is already clear. It is not something he controls, and therefore it is not something he will spend time worrying about, because in his world, control has always been the most important standard of all. Browns accused of mistreating Shedeur Sanders as ESPN expert makes bold claim. The Cleveland Browns quarterback situation has once again become one of the most talked about storylines in the NFL, and this time the focus is centered on Shedeur Sanders, Deshaun Watson, and how the organization is handling its internal competition heading into OTAs. With a new coaching regime under Todd Monken and multiple quarterbacks in the mix, the Browns are trying to reset expectations and evaluate talent in a structured way. But not everyone agrees with how that process has played out so far. ESPN Cleveland radio host Tony Rizzo recently sparked controversy after making a strong claim about how Shedeur Sanders was treated during his early time with the team. Rizzo suggested that Sanders was essentially handled like an intern rather than a legitimate starting quarterback, raising questions about whether the Browns fully committed to his development early on. According to Rizzo, the situation was shaped heavily by circumstance rather than a clean evaluation process. He pointed out that Sanders only stepped into a starting role after a series of roster changes and injuries shifted the depth chart. In his view, that meant Sanders was not given a stable or consistent opportunity to establish himself as the clear QB1 from the beginning. Rizzo also emphasized that this is not necessarily about favoritism, but about structure and timing. The Browns, like many NFL teams, often rely on veterans first, especially in situations where a younger quarterback is still developing. Deshaun Watson's experience, contract status, and past production naturally give him an advantage in any competition, regardless of public perception. Still, the intern comment has added fuel to an already heated debate about how the Browns are managing their quarterback room. From a performance standpoint, Shedeur Sanders' rookie campaign showed both promise and inconsistency. Over the course of the season, he appeared in 8 games and made 7 starts, finishing with roughly 1,400 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, and a completion rate of 56.6%. While those numbers reflect growing pains typical of a young quarterback, they also show that he was given real game opportunities to operate within the offense. For supporters of Sanders, the argument is that those opportunities were not always evenly distributed or part of a clearly defined long-term plan. Instead, they believe his role shifted based on external factors such as injuries and roster movement, rather than a consistent developmental strategy. On the other side of the debate, there is a more traditional NFL perspective. Teams often believe that young quarterbacks should earn playing time gradually, especially when competing against established veterans. From that angle, Sanders' path is not unusual, and his exposure to starting experience in his rookie year could actually be viewed as accelerated development. The arrival of Todd Monken as head coach adds another layer of complexity to the situation. Entering his first season with the Browns, Monken is expected to bring a more system-driven approach to the offense, with a focus on efficiency and adaptability. His background suggests he is comfortable tailoring his scheme to the strengths of his quarterback, rather than forcing a rigid system onto the roster. That flexibility is why some analysts, including ESPN's Albert Breer, believe Monken will ultimately handle the quarterback competition fairly. Breer noted that Monken has enough schematic versatility to build an offense around whichever quarterback earns the job, whether that is Watson, Sanders, or another option. However, fairness in evaluation does not necessarily eliminate controversy. In a high-pressure market like Cleveland, every decision at quarterback is scrutinized, especially when it involves a young player with a high-profile college background like Sanders. The Browns' quarterback room is now under a microscope, not just because of performance, but because of perception. Fans and analysts alike are trying to determine whether the organization is genuinely open to change at the position or still leaning on veteran hierarchy by default. Deshaun Watson's presence complicates that conversation even further. As a seasoned veteran with Pro Bowl experience, he naturally brings credibility and stability to the position on paper. But availability, consistency, and on-field production ultimately determine whether that experience translates into long-term starting control. That leaves the Browns in a difficult balancing act. They must evaluate a younger quarterback with developmental upside while also managing expectations tied to a high-profile veteran who has already been paid and positioned as a franchise solution in the past. For Sanders, the key challenge is not just proving he can perform, but proving he can do so within a system that may not always prioritize immediate results over long-term evaluation. His completion percentage and passing output reflect both promise and areas for growth, which is typical for quarterbacks adjusting to the speed and complexity of the NFL. What makes his situation particularly interesting is how quickly public perception can shift. A few strong performances in training camp or preseason could dramatically change how the coaching staff views his readiness. Conversely, struggles in those same environments could reinforce the idea that he still needs time before being considered a full-time starter. At its core, the debate surrounding Sanders is not just about one player. It reflects a broader NFL issue: how teams balance veteran trust with rookie development in a league where winning now is always the priority. For Cleveland, that tension is especially pronounced. The franchise has spent years searching for stability at quarterback, cycling through different options without finding a long-term answer. That history adds pressure to every decision, making patience harder to sustain and evaluation more intense. As OTAs and training camp approach, the Browns will need to define their direction more clearly, whether that means committing to Watson, accelerating Sanders' development, or allowing full competition to play out. The outcome will shape not only the 2026 season, but potentially the future of the franchise at the most important position in football. For now, the only certainty is that the conversation around Shedeur Sanders is far from settled. Baker Mayfield just got the perfect chance to shut his critics up for good. The 2026 season is shaping up to be one of the most defining years of Baker Mayfield's career, not because of what he has already accomplished, but because of what is now being asked of him in Tampa Bay. After an up and down stretch that reignited doubts about his consistency as a long-term franchise quarterback, Mayfield now enters a season where the stakes are significantly higher. The Buccaneers are not just trying to stay competitive in a weak division. They are walking into one of the most demanding schedules in the entire NFL, and nearly every week presents a legitimate playoff caliber opponent. That reality changes everything. Tampa Bay's schedule includes matchups against both the NFC North and AFC North, two of the most physically demanding divisions in football. That means games against the Packers, Lions, Bears, Vikings, Ravens, Bengals, Steelers, and Browns. On top of that, the Buccaneers will also face high-level non-divisional opponents such as the Chargers and Cowboys, both of whom are expected to remain in the playoff conversation. This is not a schedule that allows for inconsistency. There are no extended stretches of easy wins where a quarterback can settle in or recover from poor performances. Instead, every week will require precision, leadership, and above all, stability from the most important position on the field. And that is where Baker Mayfield comes in. For Mayfield, this season represents something more than just another year in Tampa Bay. It represents a chance to redefine how he is viewed across the league. His career has always been defined by extremes. At his best, he has shown the ability to play at a level that looks like a top-tier starter, capable of leading game-winning drives, extending plays under pressure, and energizing an entire offense. At his worst, inconsistency and injuries have led to stretches where his production drops and criticism intensifies. Last season, that pattern was on full display. Early in the year, Mayfield looked like a legitimate MVP candidate. At one point, the Buccaneers were sitting comfortably in contention, and his command of the offense was one of the biggest reasons for their success. But as injuries began to accumulate and the season wore on, his efficiency and impact declined. That late season dip became the focal point for critics who questioned whether he could sustain high-level play over a full season. Now those questions are back at the center of the conversation. What makes this year different is not just the pressure, but the opportunity. The Buccaneers are still built to compete, but they are not a team that can rely on overwhelming talent alone to carry them through this schedule. If they're going to win consistently, it will require Mayfield to elevate the offense against some of the strongest defenses in football. That is where the MVP conversation begins. To even enter that discussion, Mayfield will need to do more than produce solid statistics. He will need to deliver wins against elite competition, manage games under pressure, and avoid the late season regression that has followed him in previous years. The margin for error is extremely small, especially in a conference where several teams are already established as Super Bowl contenders. The NFC North alone presents a series of difficult challenges. Detroit brings one of the most complete rosters in football, with a physical identity that tests quarterbacks in every phase of the game. Green Bay continues to evolve with a young and dynamic core. Chicago is no longer an easy matchup, with a defense capable of disrupting timing and forcing mistakes. Minnesota adds another layer of complexity with its own competitive roster and defensive versatility. The AFC North may be even more demanding. Baltimore and Cincinnati both feature elite quarterback play and explosive offenses, while Pittsburgh remains one of the most disciplined and defensively sound teams in the league. Even Cleveland, often labeled as the weakest link in the division, has enough defensive talent to make life difficult for opposing quarterbacks. In that context, every game becomes a measuring stick. Every performance is evaluated not just in isolation, but as part of a larger narrative about whether Mayfield can consistently rise to the level required of a franchise quarterback. That narrative is especially important because Mayfield is entering a contract year. That adds another layer of pressure, not just for personal performance, but for long-term financial security and career stability. Quarterbacks in this position often find themselves judged more harshly because every game is viewed through the lens of future value. For Tampa Bay, the calculation is straightforward. If Mayfield plays at a high level and leads the team back into the playoffs, He solidifies himself as the long-term answer at quarterback and potentially earns a significant extension. If he struggles, the Buccaneers may be forced to reconsider their direction at the position once again. The difference between those outcomes could come down to consistency. The talent has never been the question with Mayfield. He has shown throughout his career that he can play at a high level when healthy and in rhythm. The challenge has always been sustaining that level over the course of a full season, especially when faced with adversity. That is why this year is so significant. The Buccaneers are not asking him to be perfect. They are asking him to be steady, efficient, and reliable against some of the toughest competition in football. If he can do that, the results will follow. There is also an emotional layer to this season that cannot be ignored. Mayfield has often played with a chip on his shoulder, fueled by criticism, doubt, and the perception that he has yet to fully live up to his early draft status. That mindset has helped him deliver strong performances in the past, particularly when expectations were lower. Now, however, expectations are different. This is no longer a situation where he is trying to prove he belongs in the league. This is about proving he belongs in the upper tier of starting quarterbacks who can consistently lead playoff teams and compete for championships. That distinction matters, because if Mayfield can navigate this schedule successfully, he will not only quiet critics for a season, he will fundamentally change the way his career is evaluated moving forward. A strong year against this level of competition would make it much harder to dismiss his accomplishments as streaky or situational. Instead, it would reinforce the idea that he has developed into a legitimate franchise quarterback capable of handling one of the most demanding schedules in football. But if the inconsistencies return, the questions will only grow louder. That is the reality of this moment for Baker Mayfield. The opportunity is massive, but so is the pressure. And in a season filled with elite opponents, every game will serve as a test of whether he can finally turn flashes of greatness into sustained excellence. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have one of the NFL's toughest schedules in 2026. In addition to their NFC South foes, they'll face the NFC North and AFC North divisions, which presents matchups against the Packers, Bears, Lions, Vikings, Ravens, Bengals, Steelers, and Browns. The Bucs will round out their schedule with matchups against the Chargers, Lions, and Cowboys. Almost all of the non-divisional opponents are legitimate playoff contenders, with the exception of the Cleveland Browns. It's an absolutely brutal slate that will test what the Bucs are made of. If they can overcome the challenge, nobody would benefit more than Baker Mayfield. Mayfield was an early front-runner in the MVP race last season when he had the Bucs sitting at 6-2, until injuries derailed his season and impacted his performance in the second half of the season. He's caught a lot of criticism this offseason for his subpar play down the stretch, but to say he has a chance to silence the critics this season would be an understatement. The Bucs won't be able to win many games on their 2026 schedule without a heroic effort from their quarterback. If Mayfield can rebound and lead the Buccaneers to, say, 10 or 11 wins and a return to the playoffs, he'll earn some serious consideration as the NFL MVP. Of course, he's not going into the season with individual accomplishments on the mind. All that matters is that the Buccaneers get back into the postseason after missing the playoffs last year for the first time since 2019. Heading into his fourth year as a Buccaneer, which happens to be a contract year, Mayfield is facing his toughest test yet, and he has a chance to prove himself as a legitimate franchise quarterback. NFL cannot seem to stop finding ways to disrespect Jaxon Smith-Njigba. The conversation around Jaxon Smith-Njigba has taken yet another strange turn, and this time it is not about his production on the field, his rise as one of the league's premier wide receivers, or even his record-setting season with the Seattle Seahawks. Instead, it is about something far more symbolic and arguably more frustrating from a player perspective: recognition. At the NFL Honors event in 2026, Smith-Njigba's name became part of an awkward moment when comedian Drusky intentionally mispronounced it during the awards presentation. While the moment was framed as humor on stage, it did not land the same way for many viewers who felt that one of the league's brightest young stars was being turned into the punchline of a bit that did not need to involve his identity in the first place. Now, that moment has been followed by another issue that only adds fuel to the perception that Smith-Njigba is not being taken as seriously as his production suggests he should be. According to a recent post shared by the receiver himself on Instagram, the trophy he received for Offensive Player of the Year contains a glaring error. Instead of properly identifying him as the Offensive Player of the Year, the engraving reads Defensive Player of the Year. A mistake like that is not just a minor typo or formatting issue. It is a fundamental error in one of the most prestigious recognitions a player can receive in a season. And while it may seem like a small administrative oversight on the surface, it carries a much larger symbolic weight. Awards in professional sports are not just decorative pieces of hardware. They represent validation, legacy, and public acknowledgement of a player's performance at the highest level. When those awards contain mistakes, especially ones as significant as this, it creates a perception problem that goes beyond the error itself. Smith-Njigba's reaction to the situation was understandably frustrated, but measured. He pointed out the mistake publicly, noting how ironic it was that a player being recognized for offensive excellence would receive a trophy labeled for the opposite side of the ball. His tone reflected disbelief more than anger, but the underlying message was clear. Details matter, especially when it comes to recognition at the top level of professional football. For many fans, the incident may appear humorous or simply careless, but for players, especially those who have worked their entire careers to reach elite status, these moments accumulate. When combined with earlier incidents like the mispronunciation at NFL honors, it begins to form a narrative that suggests a lack of attention to detail when it comes to one of the league's most productive receivers. Whether intentional or not, perception matters in professional sports. And right now, the perception forming around Smith-Njigba is that his accomplishments are not being highlighted with the same level of respect afforded to other elite wide receivers. That perception stands in contrast to what he has actually achieved on the field. Smith-Njigba's 2025 season was not just strong, it was historically significant. He led the league in receiving yards with 1,793, a total that ranks among the top 10 single-season performances in NFL history. He also set new franchise records for the Seattle Seahawks in both receptions and receiving yards, finishing with 119 catches and cementing his place as the focal point of the offense. Those numbers are not just Pro Bowl caliber. They are the kind of numbers that typically place a player in the conversation for Offensive Player of the Year and All-Pro honors, which he ultimately received. What makes his season even more impressive is that it came in a league that is increasingly competitive at the wide receiver position. The modern NFL is filled with explosive pass catchers, scheme-driven production, and quarterback-friendly offenses that spread the ball around. Standing out in that environment requires consistency, durability, and the ability to produce at a high level week after week. Smith-Njigba did exactly that. He became the engine of Seattle's passing attack, drawing coverage attention on nearly every snap and still finding ways to produce explosive plays. His route running, separation ability, and reliable hands made him one of the most difficult receivers to defend in the league, regardless of defensive scheme or matchup. That level of production is part of why the reaction to the trophy error feels so disproportionate to the mistake itself. It is not just about a word being wrong on a piece of hardware. It is about a player who has clearly reached elite status, not being reflected accurately in the moments meant to honor him. At the same time, it is also important to separate frustration from reality. There is no indication that Smith-Njigba is not respected within the league itself. Defensive coordinators clearly game plan for him. Opposing secondaries focus heavily on limiting his impact. And within the Seahawks organization, he has already established himself as one of the most important offensive pieces for the future. That reality is further reinforced by his recent contract extension, which reflects his standing as one of the highest valued receivers in football. His deal, reportedly worth up to $168.6 million over 4 years, places him among the most financially compensated wide receivers in NFL history. That kind of investment does not happen without organizational belief in both talent and long-term impact. In other words, while the optics of recent incidents may suggest disrespect, the league's financial and strategic decisions tell a different story. Still, perception in sports is powerful, and narratives tend to stick. When moments like award mislabeling or public mispronunciations happen, they often get amplified because they are easy to understand and emotionally relatable. Fans see them as signs of disrespect, even when they may simply be administrative mistakes or poorly executed humor. For Smith-Njigba, the challenge moving forward will not just be maintaining his elite level of production. It will also be continuing to shape the narrative around his career so that it reflects the reality of his performance, not the inconsistencies of how he is presented in off-field moments. Because on the field, there is no ambiguity. He's one of the best receivers in football. And if his trajectory continues, the conversation will eventually shift away from whether he is being respected enough and toward how long he can maintain a level of dominance that is already putting him in rare historical company. It doesn't take much for a star receiver to feel slighted in today's NFL, but the situation around Jaxon Smith-Njigba has drifted into the category of accidental chaos more than intentional disrespect. The latest mix-up, an award engraved as Defensive Player of the Year instead of Offensive Player of the Year, is the kind of mistake that immediately goes viral simply because it's so basic. For a league that brands itself on precision and presentation, errors like that stand out even more when they involve one of the NFL's rising offensive stars. And Smith-Njigba is exactly that, a centerpiece of the Seattle Seahawks offense and one of the most productive receivers in football after a historic breakout season. Last year, he didn't just produce, he dominated. Nearly 1,800 receiving yards, franchise records falling weekly, and a workload that placed him firmly in the conversation among the league's elite wideouts. That's why the trophy mistake feels less like a harmless typo and more like a tone-deaf oversight, even if it almost certainly wasn't intentional. The frustration fans are pointing to is less about one engraving and more about perception. Seattle, as a market, often doesn't generate the same national spotlight as bigger media hubs, which can make moments like this feel amplified. When a player is already putting up all pro-level production, even small errors start to feel symbolic. But the reality is probably much simpler than the narrative suggests. League awards are mass-produced, and mistakes, while rare, do happen. There's no deeper conspiracy required to explain a missing word on a trophy. What matters more is what's happening on the field. Smith-Njigba isn't being overlooked by defenses. He's being game planned against every week as a primary target. And after signing a major extension worth up to $168.6 million, he's no longer in the category of talent. He's firmly in the category of cornerstone star. Moments like this may add motivation, but they don't change perception inside NFL front offices or defensive meeting rooms. Those are already aligned on who he is. If anything, the bigger takeaway is how quickly a small administrative error can snowball into a narrative about disrespect. In reality, Smith-Njigba's production has already done the loudest talking possible. Jaxon Smith-Njigba points out glaring mistake on Offensive Player of the Year award. It's getting disrespectful. Jaxon Smith-Njigba's 2025 season was supposed to be remembered as a defining leap into superstardom, a campaign where he didn't just establish himself as one of the best receivers in football, but arguably the most productive and consistent offensive weapon in the entire league. Instead, part of the conversation around his historic year has been overshadowed by an embarrassing mistake that had nothing to do with his performance on the field and everything to do with how the NFL handled his award recognition. Smith-Njigba led the NFL in receiving yards with 1,793, adding 10 touchdowns in a season that placed him firmly in the All-Pro conversation and elevated him into the top tier of wide receivers. His impact was not limited to regular season production either. He carried that dominance into Seattle's postseason run, producing explosive performances in key moments, including a standout NFC Championship game where he torched the Los Angeles Rams for 153 yards and 2 touchdowns, helping push the Seahawks deeper into contention. By every football metric, it was a season worthy of elite recognition. And when the time came for league honors, Smith-Njigba was rightfully expected to be celebrated as the Offensive Player of the Year, an award that typically reflects dominance, consistency, and game-breaking ability on the offensive side of the ball. But what should have been a straightforward moment of celebration quickly turned into an unexpected controversy when Smith-Njigba noticed something unusual about the physical trophy he received. At first glance, it might seem like a minor manufacturing error or a simple spelling mistake with his name, especially given how often complex hyphenated names can be mishandled. However, the issue turned out to be far more surprising and, frankly, more embarrassing. Instead of correctly identifying him as the Offensive Player of the Year, the trophy reportedly read Defensive Player of the Year. For a league that prides itself on precision, branding, and presentation, the mistake immediately stood out as a glaring oversight. And Smith-Njigba himself was the one who brought it into the spotlight. Rather than quietly addressing the issue behind the scenes, he posted about it on Instagram, pointing out the error directly and expressing frustration. His message was short, but the tone was clear. This was not just a harmless typo in his eyes. It represented a lack of attention to detail for one of the most prestigious awards in professional football. His reaction quickly gained traction across social media, with fans, analysts, and fellow athletes weighing in on how such a mistake could happen at the league's highest level of recognition. Adding another layer to the public reaction, Smith-Njigba's brother, Kanan, also commented on the situation online, reinforcing the idea that this was not being taken lightly within his inner circle. The combination of player and family response helped escalate what might have otherwise been a minor administrative correction into a widely discussed league embarrassment. As the story spread, initial assumptions suggested that the issue might have been related to mislabeling or confusion surrounding award categories. However, the NFL later clarified the situation through spokesperson Brian McCarthy, revealing that the problem was not quite what people initially believed. According to the league, the trophy did not actually say Defensive Player of the Year. Instead, it contained a spelling error reading offensive rather than offensive. While that clarification corrected the misunderstanding about the award category, it did little to reduce the overall embarrassment of the situation. The NFL acknowledged the mistake publicly and issued an apology to Smith-Njigba, stating that a corrected version of the trophy would be produced and shipped to him. McCarthy emphasized that the error did not reflect Smith-Njigba's actual accomplishments or the league's recognition of his performance, adding a touch of humor in referencing how well he performed against opposing defenses throughout the season. Even with the apology, the incident has raised broader questions about quality control in high-profile league operations. Awards of this magnitude are meant to represent the highest level of achievement in professional football. They are symbolic, permanent representations of a player's legacy. A mistake in wording, especially on something as significant as a Player of the Year award, undermines the sense of prestige that comes with it. For Smith-Njigba, however, the frustration likely goes beyond just a typo. This was a season where he reached a new level as a player. He wasn't just producing highlight plays or occasional big games. He was consistently dominant week after week against top-tier competition. Leading the league in receiving yards is not a small accomplishment, and doing so in a modern NFL that increasingly emphasizes offensive parity makes it even more significant. That is part of why his reaction carried weight. When a player performs at that level, the expectation is that recognition will match the achievement. Seeing an error on the award itself disrupts that sense of validation. The situation also highlights how quickly moments like this can escalate in the modern NFL era. In the past, a mistake on a trophy might have remained a quiet correction handled internally between the player and the league office. Today, however, social media changes that dynamic entirely. Players now have the ability to immediately broadcast issues to millions of followers, forcing public accountability in real time. That shift has advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it ensures transparency and rapid correction of mistakes. On the other, it amplifies even small administrative errors into league-wide talking points. In this case, the amplification worked quickly. Within hours, the issue moved from a personal frustration to a national sports discussion. Meanwhile, the broader context of Smith-Njigba's season remains unchanged. His statistical production places him among the elite receiver seasons in NFL history. A 1,793-yard campaign is not just impressive, it is historically significant. Only a select group of wide receivers have ever reached that level of production, and fewer still have done so while also serving as the primary focal point of a playoff offense. That context is important because it reinforces why the award itself matters. Players at that level are not just competing for weekly recognition. They are building legacies that will be evaluated years or even decades later. In that sense, even a small mistake in engraving can feel disproportionately frustrating because it touches something permanent. The league's response, while swift, is ultimately corrective rather than preventative. A new trophy will be made, the spelling will be fixed, and the issue will likely fade from headlines. But moments like this tend to linger in fan memory, not because of the error itself, but because of how unexpected it was. For Smith-Njigba, the focus will likely return quickly to football. His trajectory is clearly upward, and expectations for his future seasons will remain high. If anything, a season like this typically serves as a launching point for even greater recognition, both in awards and legacy discussions. Still, the irony of the situation remains difficult to ignore. A player who dominated defenses all season ended up briefly at the center of a story not about his offensive brilliance, but about a mistake on an award meant to celebrate it. And in a league where every detail is supposed to matter, that small error became a surprisingly loud moment in an otherwise quiet off-season conversation.